Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this Joseph Rowntree event, launching our Poverty in Scotland 2021 report. My name is Chris Burke. I'm the Associate Director of JRF here in Scotland. I'm delighted to be joined here in Dundee by the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice, Housing and Local Government, Joseph Rowntree MSP. Morning.
Morning.
We'll be hearing from her shortly. And this report kicks off a really important week. This is the first day of Challenge Poverty Week, where people up and down Scotland are uniting in their efforts to end poverty. But sadly, the report also comes out with a bit of a cloud hanging over it, with the UK government in just under 2 days planning one of the biggest cuts to the basic rate of social security since the inception of the welfare state, really. Hopefully, the Chancellor and Prime Minister, while they're at their conference, will have time to chat about this and change their minds, because this is an avoidable way in which they're going to send hundreds of thousands of people across the UK and tens of thousands in Scotland into poverty. So they must change their minds. But back to our report. We think this report is really important because it shows us a picture just as we entered the pandemic. And the pandemic has really shone a light on the inequalities and the poverty that we see in Scotland, with 1 million people in poverty and around 250,000 children. COVID has really shone a harsh light on the realities. The shocking figure of almost 2.5 times more likely to die from COVID if you're in one of our poorer communities than our richer ones. It's why meeting these child poverty targets is so important, because we need to fix the things that COVID has shone a light on. But COVID has also taught us about the art of the possible. The Scottish Government, the UK Government, local government, businesses, charities, even individuals have all done things that probably before the pandemic they might have said was impossible. So with kindness, compassion, innovation, urgency, we've been able to help each other really quite well. So that's, I think, the kind of urgency that we want to take into our national mission to meet our child poverty targets. And the report that we set out today, in some ways, is quite challenging to the Scottish Government. And I think that pays testament to Ms. Robeson being here with us today and to the approach that the Scottish Government are taking. If this is to be a national mission, yes, it starts at the door of the Scottish Government, but we all have to play our role in creating that better Scotland that we all want to see. So there's much work to be done. Part of the message of our report today is this is possible and we need to kind of get on and do it. So just to set out what the next hour is going to be, we've tried to keep this relatively short because we appreciate that people are a bit zoomed out after the pandemic. So I'll shortly hand over to Ms. Robeson, who will set out her kind of vision for this national mission. We'll then hear from our senior analyst in Scotland, Carla Sabula, who will set out some of the main findings from the report. And then our End Poverty Scotland group, who are a group of people from across Scotland who've experienced poverty or low income, who helped us write the report, are going to get a chance to put some questions to the Cabinet Secretary. If we do have some time at the end, which I suspect we won't, we might try and put in an extra couple of questions. So if you have any burning ideas, please do stick them in the chat. My colleagues, Deborah and Jack, will be keeping an eye on those. And if the Cabinet Secretary doesn't have time to get back to you, we'll try and answer as many as we can as we go along. But anyway, enough for me. Over to Ms. Robeson.
Thanks very much, Chris, and good morning, everyone. I'm looking forward to your questions later on, and thanks very much for listening to what I have to say. This is a really important conference during Challenge Poverty Week, and it comes at a crucial time for Scotland as we collectively embark on our recovery from COVID, and we strive towards a fairer, more prosperous society, and of course commit to addressing some of the long-standing inequalities that have without doubt been worsened by the pandemic. As ever, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's analysis, advocacy and challenge is an essential part of this endeavour, and I particularly want to thank the people who lent their voices to your report and shared their thoughts and experiences. Around a quarter of children in Scotland live in poverty, but as set out in our Tackling Child Poverty Delivery Plan, this experience is much more likely in certain household types. This includes lone parent households and those with a disabled family member, and we know the damage that poverty causes to people and to communities, and that's why this Scottish Government has declared a national mission to end child poverty. In 2020-21, we invested around £2.5 billion to support low-income households, including nearly £1 billion to directly support children. Our programme for government builds on this investment and sets out a range of ambitious actions to make ending child poverty a reality. Now, I'm sure you'll agree we need a balanced approach to tackle poverty. There's not one single solution, and we're committed to making use of all of the powers available to us, and we're using these to influence the three key drivers of poverty and to mitigate the impacts of poverty on children, to improve their life chances and ensure they reach their potential. We're continuing to invest in more and better homes, and we'll deliver 110,000 affordable homes by 2032, with at least 70% in the social rented sector and 10% in our more rural communities, because we recognise that good quality affordable housing is a key anti-poverty driver. We'll publish a new rented sector strategy to deliver a new deal for tenants, safeguarding them from unaffordable rent increases. And by the end of this year, we will have allocated over £1 billion since 2009 to tackle fuel poverty, helping to ensure families' energy costs are affordable. And of course, as we head into this winter with rising energy prices, fuel poverty is a top concern for us. Advice services also play a crucial role across Scotland's communities in helping people to understand their rights and to seek solutions in a range of areas such as money and debt, housing and homelessness, social security and consumer issues. That's why this year we are distributing over £12 million to support the provision of free welfare and debt advice. In addition, we'll be investing more than £4.5 million over the next 2 years to place dedicated welfare rights advisors into 150 GP practices in our most deprived areas, and to expand the pilots of advice in education settings. And these are really vital to increase household incomes and reduce the costs they face, and make sure that that advice is located where people are and it can be accessed more easily. In relation to social security, we continue to strengthen the support available to families, rooting our services in dignity and respect, and on the fundamental understanding that social security is an investment to the people of Scotland. Nowhere is this clearer than in our package of 5 family benefits available through the early years. And in the first 100 days of the new government, we strengthened the support offered through Best Start Foods, further increasing the value of payments, and we've committed to increasing eligibility for this support during the parliamentary term, supporting up to 60,000 more people each year. Our 3 Best Start grants continue to support families with much more generous support across the early years. And of course, we've commenced delivery of the Scottish Child Payment for children under 6, reaching up to 133,000 children this year with this ambitious and unique payment. And together, this package is providing about £5,300 of financial support, crucial financial support for families by the time their first child turns 6, and £5,000 for second and subsequent children. But we're going further, and we'll double the value of the Scottish Child Payment to £20 every week as soon as we possibly can, and we'll set out our plans to do so in the forthcoming budget. We've also brought forward support for older children through the new bridging payments, which will provide £520 a year for around 148,000 children of school age in advance of the full rollout of the payment by the end of next year. And I think this demonstrates our commitment to work with pace and determination and vigour to tackle child poverty and to deliver new and innovative solutions with our partners. Not only this, but of course we're committed to double the value of carers allowance supplement this December, benefiting around 91,000 carers in Scotland. And of course we've introduced legislation to extend our child winter heating allowance to more than 19,400 disabled children and young people to help their families heat their homes this winter. Very important, given the challenges that we will face and families will face this winter. Social security is a key strand in our approach to tackling child poverty, but we recognise fully the need to ensure that parents are able to work and earn more and are supported in doing so. And that's why we've committed to a range of new actions to do just that. We've already completed our massive expansion of funded early learning and childcare to 1,140 hours for all 3 and 4-year-olds, and have now set out the next stage of this programme within the programme for government. We'll further expand free early learning and childcare to 1 and 2-year-olds, and we'll build a system of wraparound school-age childcare, offering care before and after school, and importantly, in the holidays. Together, these actions could be truly game-changing for both children and for their parents, ensuring that children get access to the high-quality experiences they need to flourish, and parents can access employment, training and learning safe in the knowledge that their children are being cared for in a quality environment. In the next 2 years, we want to strengthen our support for the Parental Employability Support Fund, investing a further £15 million to give parents access to the holistic support they need to enter and progress in work. And we've set out plans to develop a bespoke service for lone parents to access the employability services and support that they need to get into employment. We recognise the barriers that are there, and we need to help remove those. All of this action is taking place in the context, of course, of a global pandemic that has changed all of our lives in ways that we could not have imagined a couple of years ago, and of course has made reducing poverty that much harder. And we know that there are further challenges ahead with the end of furlough, the rising energy costs, national insurance increases hitting those on low earnings, creating a perfect storm which threatens to overwhelm families. And that's why, as Chris said, it's so incomprehensible that the UK government would proceed with its removal of the £20 universal credit uplift, which risks pushing a further 60,000 Scots, including 20,000 children, into poverty. This single act is estimated to rip a staggering £461 million from Scottish households at a time when this money is needed most. And fundamental flaws in the social security system, such as the 2-child limit, benefit cap, 5-week wait persist and continue to make it harder for families to escape poverty. And whilst we continue to lobby for a reversal of these regressive policies, we will not let that distract us from our national mission to end poverty and do what we can do here in Scotland. And this includes the further steps we can take to provide the immediate support for people this winter, strengthening the wide range of measures we've already put in place. We've heard the voices of people living in poverty loud and clear. We hear the cry that now is the time for decisive action, and that warm words are not enough. We absolutely understand that COVID recovery must and will deliver tangible improvements for children living in poverty. The Scottish Government's COVID recovery strategy will focus on those who have been most affected by the pandemic, and will set out how we rebuild a stronger but fairer society. All of this work will be underpinned by our Fairer Scotland duty. This tool supports better decision-making across the public sector. It will help to ensure that strategic decisions contribute to reducing poverty and inequality. And I'm pleased to announce this morning that we've published revised Fairer Scotland guidance today, reflecting learning from the first 3 years of implementation. As Chris said earlier on, it is everybody's business, and it's everybody's business across the Scottish Government. And I've made that clear to all of my ministerial colleagues, and they know that. And whilst we've come a long way in tackling child poverty, we still have a journey ahead of us, as laid out in the report today. Now is the time to make bold and ambitious change for the greater good of children and young people in communities across Scotland. Not only will we further enhance the support available to families this winter, but we'll put in place the measures needed in the long term too. The Scottish Child Payment is one game-changing policy, but we need more than that. And we're working across government to identify these at pace now. In doing so, we'll strive to ensure that our policies deliver for those who need them, focusing on supporting the 6 priority families that we've identified who so often face additional barriers to accessing services and employment, including discrimination, structural barriers that keep them trapped in a cycle of poverty. We know that supporting these families in particular is the key to lifting thousands of children out of poverty. And I think that chimes very well with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation report and focus on the priority families today. Government, as Chris said, can't do it alone, nor would we want to. We've got to work together to deliver the change needed and achieve a fairer and more prosperous Scotland. We have to listen to what the families tell us they need and not to always assume that we have all the answers. So we will publish our next Tackling Child Poverty Delivery Plan by the end of March next year, and this will set out a critical path in reducing child poverty and achieving the target set. So I look forward to working with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and others in the development of the plan to set out the game-changing policies required to eradicate child poverty in Scotland. Thanks for listening. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Cabinet Secretary. I think there's much in that to welcome for many people and to recognise the scale of the challenge and to set out, and really appreciate the focus on the priority groups as well, because I do think for all of us that's where we need to put a lot of our thinking. So that takes us nicely then to my colleague Carla, who I should thank for the enormous amount of work she put into the production of this report. And she's now going to take us through some of the main findings of the report, including some reflections on the priority groups as we discussed. So over to you, Carla. I'll give you a second to get your slides up.
I'll just share my screen. Okay, I hope you can all see that. Okay.
Yep.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for joining today. So yeah, I'm going to take you through the main findings from the report from this year. And I think for many of you here, it's not going to be a big surprise, but I think it is important to sort of highlight these. And I think throughout the presentation, I hope that you'll keep in mind this year's Challenge Poverty Week theme, which is Now is the Time. So this chart shows the poverty rate before and after housing costs and the deep poverty rate for all people in Scotland over the last 20 years. And each of these types of poverty were decreasing between around 1998 to around 2012. And since then, they've been increasing year on year, resulting in around 1 in 5 people in Scotland prior to the pandemic living in poverty after housing costs. The deep poverty rate after housing costs is now at a similar level to it was around 20 years ago, and the gap between the poverty rate and the deep poverty rate has been closing. This means that more people in poverty after housing costs are in deeper poverty now than was the case in 1998 and 2001. We also know that some groups are more at risk of experiencing poverty, and in the latest data, we found that single people, but specifically people in single parent families, have a higher poverty rate than coupled families, with 2 in 5 people in single parent families living in poverty. Work is also another really important factor. So 1 in 10 people in a family where there's somebody in full-time work were living in poverty. 3 times that amount were in poverty when there was nobody in full-time work, but somebody was in part-time work. And then if you're living in a family where there's nobody in work, almost over half of people were living in poverty. And this is something we're going to come back to later on as well. 2 in 5 people from a minority ethnic background were living in poverty. And if you rent your house, you're also more likely to be at risk of living in poverty. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to speak to you about the child poverty targets that the Scottish Parliament set back in 2017 and how we're progressing in reaching these targets. We're going to focus a lot of our attention on the priority groups, and these are the types of different types of household that the Scottish Government identified as being at a greater risk of poverty. 4 in 5 children in poverty are in one of these priority groups. So as was mentioned earlier, to meet the child poverty targets, we're going to have to focus on these priority groups. There are 4 different targets for 2031, and they measure different aspects of poverty. For each measure of poverty, the current level is more than double that of the target for 2031. The relative poverty is the measure that we use for most of this webinar, and it falls if poorer households' incomes catch up with the middle incomes. Absolute poverty is a bit different from other measures of absolute poverty that you might have heard of. It measures the proportion of children that live in families that have incomes that would have been below the relative poverty line back in 2010. And it shows whether incomes have been improving faster than the cost of living over time. So we usually expect absolute poverty to fall as incomes and living standards increase over time. Material deprivation is the proportion of children living in families that cannot afford a range of basic goods and services. So these are things such as having a warm winter coat or being able to go on a school trip at least once a term. And it's also whether they have a low income after housing costs. And persistent poverty is the extent to which families remain trapped in poverty over a period of time. For relative poverty, there's also an interim target, which is fast approaching. So by April 2024, the Scottish Government want there to be a maximum of 18% of children living in poverty in Scotland. And we're currently 6 percentage points above that, with the rising tide of poverty and the impacts of COVID-19 still to be seen. So focusing in on relative poverty and the priority groups, you can see here that for all the priority groups, we are well above the targets, and the poverty rate for all the priority groups is above that for all children. In particular, almost half of children who live in a minority ethnic household and 2 in 5 children in single parent households are living in poverty. The poverty rate for children in a minority ethnic household is also double that of all children. We also had a look at children who were in more than one priority group. So you can see here that the poverty rate for children in one priority group is just less than double the poverty rate of children in no priority groups. And the poverty rate for children in 2 or more priority groups is almost 3 times that of children in no priority groups. There's also quite an interesting point to draw from this, which is that in the latest year of data for children in no priority groups, the poverty rate is 13%. And this is below the 2024 interim target and is actually quite close to our 2031 target. So it shows that we must consider these drivers of poverty for the priority group families. And if these could be tackled, then it shows that Scotland would be in a much better place for these children. There is somewhere that we can go, and for the children in no priority groups, we are getting closer to reaching these levels. We also updated some modelling that we had done earlier this year to look at some different scenarios around social security. 3 scenarios that we looked at different levels of the Scottish Child Payment and whether we were going to keep the Universal Credit and Working Tax Credit uplift. So the first scenario, the Scottish Child Payment was kept at £10 per week, and the Universal Credit and Working Tax Credits were cut. The second scenario, the Scottish Child Payment is doubled to £20 per week, but Universal Credit and Working Tax Credit is cut. And the final scenario, which is the most optimistic, is that the Scottish Child Payment is doubled to £20 per week, and Universal Credit and Working Tax Credit uplift is kept. And you can see here on the chart, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, I hope you can. The triangle is still above the 2024 target of 18%, and this means that we would miss it without further interventions. On the right of the screen, I've also popped the poverty rates for each of the priority groups in our most optimistic scenario, which is to keep the £20 uplift and for the Scottish Child Payment to be doubled. You can see that for each of the priority groups, the poverty rate is much higher than for all children, but it's still well off the target. For some groups, there's also been very little progress towards reducing the poverty rate, for example, for children in minority ethnic households. We also looked at some of the drivers of poverty for the priority groups to look for differences and similarities in what locks these families in poverty. Because of the number of people in the data, we could only look at large households, single parent households, and households where there was someone with a disability. We found that across all the groups, a higher proportion of children were in a household where nobody was in work compared to all children in poverty. So nearly 4 in 10 children in poverty in a large household, 5 in 10 children in poverty in a household where someone is disabled, and more than 6 in 10 children in poverty in a single parent household were living in a household where there was nobody in work. We also found that of all the three priority groups that we looked at, housing was a driver for single parent households. They were more likely to be pushed into poverty due to their housing costs than other children in poverty. And over half of children in single parent households were in unaffordable housing. So in this chart, you can see that the proportion is higher than for all children in poverty. So they were more likely to be spending 30% or more of their income on housing. But when you compare this to single parent households in poverty in England, you can see that even more children in this group in England are in unaffordable housing. So housing is an even bigger driver of poverty for this group in England. In all 3 priority groups that we looked at, a higher proportion were receiving universal credit or equivalent than all children in poverty. And this again shows how essential adequate social security is for children in the priority groups. And this was particularly the case for single parent households. Okay, so from the slides I showed earlier, it's clear that work was a driver of poverty for children in the priority groups. And it also was the case in the first couple of slides that people in families where nobody is in work had one of the highest poverty rates in all of the groups that we've looked at in our report. So we decided to look a bit further at workless families in Scotland to better understand who is in workless families and to look for other drivers of poverty that they might experience above and beyond work. So we identified 3 clear groups of workless families. Over half were inactive, and this means that no adults were working or looking for work. 23% were in full-time education or training, or had at least one person in full-time education or training. And 23% had 1 or more people who were unemployed, meaning that they were not in work, but were looking for work. We wanted to look a bit further at the inactive group to better understand why the adults in these families were inactive. So if we look at the adults in these households, we found that the majority are permanently sick or disabled, and that a further 4% are temporarily sick or injured. We also had a further look at the poverty rates for each type of workless family, and we found that people in unemployed families had an extremely high poverty rate, with over 3/4 of people in unemployed families living in poverty in Scotland. So we know that poverty is a driver of poverty for children in Scotland. But when we had a look at the different types of families that made up workless families, we actually found that the majority of them are single people, with the 3rd largest family type being single parent families. We also had a look at the age of the head of family, and we found that workless families in poverty tend to have a younger head of family than the working age population. And a really important point that we drew from this is that almost 1/3 of unemployed workless families that are living in poverty in Scotland have a head that is entitled to lower universal credit rates due to being under the age of 25. Now, from this slide I showed you earlier on information why working age adults are inactive, it is not surprising that over 2/3 of inactive families in poverty have someone who is disabled in their family. And this could be an adult or a child. But in addition to this, 1/3 of unemployed families have someone in their family who is disabled. So some additional drivers beyond work include a lower take-up of universal credit or equivalent than would be expected, and few workless families were pushed into poverty due to housing costs, as most were already living on low incomes to start with. However, this does mean that for these families, they were being pushed into further deeper poverty due to this. And this was particularly the case for unemployed families. Across all workless family types, the proportion of families in unaffordable housing was too high. And again, this was because incomes were particularly low to start with. And over 70% of unemployed families were in unaffordable housing. So finally, woven throughout all these slides I've shown you so far, there's a clear message that families should be able to access adequate social security when they need it. Over the last year, particularly with job insecurity and furlough, it's important that we can all access good social security. Additionally, for families that are not expected to work, whether this is due to a disability or caring responsibilities, they should not be trapped in poverty for using the social security system. So I'm going to show you 2 example families to show you how far our current system takes us. So this chart shows the monthly income for a single parent with 2 young children who is not working. It compares the income they have over time with different levels of Scottish Child Payment and to different income lines. There's 3 different income lines. These are destitution, the poverty line, and the minimum income standard. So the destitution line identifies when families have enough to afford the absolute basic essentials that we need to eat, stay warm, dry, and keep clean. The poverty line is 60% of the median income, and that's a poverty measure that I've used throughout most of this presentation. And the minimum income standard is a vision of a standard of living that society agrees we should all be able to expect as a minimum, and allows us to have opportunities and choices to participate in society. So for this family, they are across all these periods, and with the extension to the Scottish Child Payment and the doubling of the Scottish Child Payment, this family are trapped in poverty in every single time period. So this family are a couple with 3 children. Their children are slightly older, they're aged 3, 5, and 7. And one of the parents is in full-time work and the other is in part-time work. So in 2013-14 and in 2020-21, this family had an income above the poverty line, although as you can see in this chart, they were quite a lot further over the poverty line in 2013-14. In 2021-22, this family were in poverty without the Scottish Child Payment. The Scottish Child Payment pushes them over the poverty line, and with the extension to the Scottish Child Payment and the doubling of the Scottish Child Payment, they're pushed further over the poverty line. Here you can see that this family have been financially pushed by the current system. And while social security can help lift families out of poverty, it is not lifting every family out of poverty. And in none of our example families are they brought close to the minimum income standard. So I hope that throughout this, you've picked up on the message that the time is now. And I'm going to pass back to Chris, who's going to go through our asks and then is going to go on to the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Carla. I mean, that's fascinating stuff, and it's worth reflecting on the social security adequacy one as well, is that our colleagues at JRF down south have also looked at other households who wouldn't be eligible for the Scottish Child Payment, and for single people, universal credit leaves them destitute. It's an outrageous position, and as Carla has highlighted, for many single people, if you are workless, then the social security system drops you into destitution, a really outrageous position. And obviously single people become parents as we go on. So it's really important. And thanks so much for that, Carla. If you could just go on to the next slide, please. So these are our asks, which I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary is tired of hearing. So doubling the child payment as soon as you can, which we're already committed to. We look forward to hearing in the budget when that will be. Increasing the scale and pace of programs designed to help priority group families. And this is something we did a bit of work earlier this year with One Parent Family Scotland and Fife Gingerbread to look at single parents in particular. And this is one of the key findings, is there's lots of useful programs out there, but targeted specifically at those families is really important. Work with local government to identify areas of high rates of worklessness amongst families that are targeted. Because there are areas, there are real pockets in Scotland. What was Strathclyde, Dundee, where we are today, and Aberdeen City see some of these real concentrations. We are already delighted to be part of the work that the Scottish Government is doing on a minimum income guarantee, and we think that's a really vital piece of work. And then continue with our commitment to improve job quality and accessibility for everyone. I suppose on that final point, is something we'd said prior to the election, is, you know, improving job quality, getting people's skills up, etc., takes time. So it's why it means Social Security sometimes has to pick up the slack meantime. If you just should go on, Carla, obviously the UK government have a massive role to play in this. I've sort of stuck to a line now of, with reserve power comes reserve responsibility. So they mustn't cut universal credit and working tax credits. And then there's just the general inadequacy of Social Security. The Cabinet Secretary talked about some of the most egregious areas. I mean, the 5-week wait is causing destitution all over the UK. And it's really an outrageous position. And then this is something for both governments to think about, and for local government. This is something that came through very clearly from our work with the End Poverty Scotland group. It's about making services more human. This idea of a kind of no wrong door, that it's really difficult sometimes to be able to access the support that you're eligible to, and which people have gone out of their way to provide. But it's so hard sometimes to just the time, the stress to get there. Structural inequalities within support systems. Carl identified one there about people who are under 25 having lower rates of universal credit. We can't really see a good reason for that, and it's causing poverty. And then just greater accountability to people living in poverty. We've seen in Scotland already the work of Social Security Scotland in designing and building their system with people. That's so important. That delivers better services and better outcomes. And it is good to see the Scottish Government committed to that kind of approach, and the more of it, the better. Okay, so I think that now takes us to our Q&A section. If Carla, if you could drop that slide. And so we have a few members of our group with us this morning, and in both good and bad news, Amy, who's going to ask the first question, has got a new job, which is great, but it also means she's not able to ask her question to the Cabinet Secretary. So I am going to be a poor substitute at this stage, I'm afraid. And the first question is a tricky one, because I know these are things civil servants won't give you answers to quite rightly. So Amy really wanted to ask you is what most excites you about your role? Why are you passionate about it? And what would you want to achieve in the role?
Well, thanks, Amy, for your question. And what most excites me is this agenda. What I want to achieve is meeting those interim targets. What excites me is the ability across my portfolio to join the dots, but most importantly, that we join the dots across the whole of government. This can't be just for my portfolio to progress, and it can't just really be for the Scottish Government to progress. Now, the only further observation I would make about the UK government before setting them aside is, 85% of Social Security spend is reserved. It's UK government spend, which of course Scottish taxpayers contribute to. So it's important. However, our focus is whatever the UK government choose to do, and if they don't do the right thing, it makes our work harder. It makes meeting those relative child poverty targets harder, but we are absolutely determined to do what we can to leave no stone unturned. And I guess for me, it's professional. It's what my job is, but it's also personal. When I grew up in a household where my dad was in and out of work, and it was back in the days where there was a lot of stigma around. So take free school meals, for example. You had to go and queue at the front of the class to get your free school meal ticket, and my mum didn't want me to do that, so she went out of her way, even though it was tough, to avoid me having to do that. But I saw other kids having to get up and do that, and it just stuck with me so much. So there were no holidays, there was none of the things that, some families at the time would have taken for granted. So for me, and just finally on that bit of personal journey, I was the first person in my family to ever get a degree at university, and my mum drummed into me the importance of education. So for me, there are so many levers that we need to use to help kids who are in that position or worse. Now that it is about, yes, it's about social security, it's about Scottish Child Payment, but it's also about education and making sure the attainment fund works to help give every child the best start in life and the best educational opportunities. It's about work and breaking down the barriers to work and actually bespoke support for families. We talked, there was the slide up about no wrong door. For some families, they don't even know where the door is because there's so many things going on in their life. Finding the door is difficult. So we need to work directly with those families to work along, get alongside them to help to remove those barriers. And they will be different for different families as well. So that hopefully, Amy, gives you a bit of a flavour of what gets me going and gets me up in the morning to do this job.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much. Michelle, I'll give you a wee second to get your camera on and unmute. But our next question, actually comes from Michelle Wilson, who's a member of our group.
Hi. It was hailed as a landmark moment by many when Scottish Parliament voted to incorporate the United Nations Conventions of the Rights of the Child into Scottish law. What do you think the real impacts it will make to children currently in poverty over the lifetime of this Parliament once it's in force?
Well, thanks, Michelle. Now, you will be aware that we're in a bit of a tricky situation with the Supreme Court. I said I wasn't going to mention the UK government again. I was just setting aside. However, let me just mention them one more time, and that is, of all things to go to court over, it is astonishing for me that the UK government would seek to kind of choose a fight about the incorporation of the UNCRC. So we need to wait and see what the transpires out of that Supreme Court case. I think it's about rights and giving people rights that they can then use in order to affect change. Is it a magic bullet that will, suddenly, sweep away poverty? And no, it won't. But it sends out a very strong signal that the rights of children need to be recognised in domestic law, and that people can then use those rights to essentially push forward their entitlements. And further to that, I think it chimes very well with the human rights legislation and bill that will be coming in this Parliament, where there will be a number of rights that will be enshrined in domestic law through the human rights bill that will entitle people. So, for example, the right to a home, which we obviously need to get the definition right, is for me really, really important as we tackle homelessness and in all its forms. And I don't just mean not having a roof over your head, I mean not having an adequate roof over your head. So I think all of these things just push forward a rights-based approach in Scotland that help people who are, if you like, kind of lacking in being able to enforce their rights. It gives more power to their elbow. It doesn't sweep away all of the issues we're talking about here today, but it does help, I think.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Michelle. We've got a quick other question from Amy, which was thinking about the graphic that Carla shared, which showed the different families close to destitution, poverty, etc. For some people, it's hard not to feel a sense of despair. What would you say to those who are feeling that this is kind of an impossible problem?
Yeah, what I would say is we want to get alongside you and try to help navigate you and your family out of the poverty trap that you maybe have felt trapped in for too long. Now, the solution for every family may be different. For some families, it might be the ability to get affordable, flexible childcare or care that enables the family to and the parents to be able to take advantage of employment opportunities at the minimum of the living wage, because obviously we've talked about work, but unfortunately too many families are trapped in low paid intermittent work that is is at minimum wage rates, and that of course is a huge challenge. So we need to push up wages. The living wage here in Scotland obviously is a level higher than the minimum wage, and we want to make sure that work pays and is stable and is there as a lever. However, it's not just work, it is about access to childcare, access to employability, and that needs to be affordable as well. So what I would like to do as we work more closely with the 6 priority families is to develop sort of bespoke solutions, because every family is different. Every family will have identified the things that are the barriers to them. I think we need to listen more to that and then work with the families to remove those barriers. And I think we can go a long way in doing that.
Lovely, thanks a lot. Brian, over in Glasgow, over to you for your question.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary, and thank you for coming along today. And good morning to the attendees. And again, thank you for coming along today. The report and figures presented by Carla today tell a worrying story about poverty, and that's before the pandemic. For many, the pandemic made things and the situation a lot worse. We are in a situation where the pandemic is not yet over, and the economic consequences are still being felt, yet support is being withdrawn. There is a real risk of more families falling into poverty. So the question, Cabinet Secretary, is what will the Scottish Government do to catch and support these families?
So Brian, I mean, you're absolutely right. You've identified what feels to me about the brewing of a perfect storm as we head into winter, with the rise in energy costs, the rise in fuel costs, the national insurance contributions, the cut of universal credit. I mean, if you were to write a kind of how to increase poverty paper, you would probably put all of those things in if that was what you were trying to do in a perverse sense. So we have an immediate issue of winter. So we are looking as a government about some immediate supports around all of those things, particularly around fuel and food, to get alongside the support families through this challenging winter. Now, we have some supports that are really important. So at the end of this month, people will get, eligible families will get another pandemic support payment of £130, which will help, but we recognise there's more that needs to be done. So we are on the case at this moment, working through the resilience meetings to identify what more across government we can do to help families in the short and immediate term through this winter, while we develop some of the more bigger game-changing policies that we will then put into our child poverty delivery plan for March of next year. So hopefully, Brian, that gives you some assurance that we recognise the immediacy of this.
Thank you. We're back to Michelle.
Hi, I think you partially answered this earlier, but it's often really difficult to know what you're entitled to, never mind actually get it. What can the Scottish Government do to make that easier?
You're right, Michelle, and actually, one of the things obviously was the duty to promote entitlement. So ministers in Scotland, unlike UK counterparts, have a duty to promote benefit uptake. So looking at it from a different lens, I mean, you can't help but to get the impression by all of the evidence that can be presented that the way that the UK Government Department of Work and Pensions works is to try and avoid people claiming, and then to make it as difficult as possible when they do claim. Social Security Scotland works a very, very different way. So they are trying to get out there as much as can, given the restrictions still, but to really get out there and promote in a proactive way entitlement. So what I said in my opening remarks around, you know, getting alongside GPs, getting into schools, getting alongside where people are, so that we're not expecting families to just happen to know or to happen to see the right leaflet or hear the right broadcast on radio about it, even though these things are important. We want to make sure that we look at every possibility to make sure people know what they are entitled to. And entitlement, I think, is a good word, because we need to get away from the stigma. Social Security Scotland is about an entitlement and support that people are entitled to receive, rather than something that is seen as a stigma that in the past too many benefits have been seen as. So if you take the child disability payment as a good example, that was piloted in 3 local authority areas, including the City of Dundee. And we had local teams from Social Security Scotland working, and where possible, actually sitting alongside families to take them through the process of applying, encouraging, helping, rather than putting barriers up. And I think that ethos of Social Security Scotland is important. It's about dignity, it's about support, encouragement, rather than trying to put people off getting the support they're entitled to. A very different culture. And hopefully that culture will encourage more people who are entitled but not yet claiming to come forward and get the supports that they're entitled to.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michelle. And just over to our last question from our group, which comes from Brian again.
Yes, hello again, it's me. So, Cabinet Secretary, do you think that the Scottish Government will achieve the interim and 2030 targets for child poverty? If yes, what are the policies that will reverse the current trends, and what are their impact on specific family types within the priority groups?
Well, Brian, thanks for your question. Yes, we can, but we've got a lot of work to do, and our job has been made more difficult by the UC cut of £20. I mean, you saw that from the slides that, you know, the gap would have been closed more if that UC uplift had been left in place. So the action of the UK government has made our job more difficult, and it's important that we put that onto the table. So that means that in addition to the doubling of the Scottish Child Payment, which obviously does have an impact, there's more we need to do. So the work that I described about the work across the whole of government, looking at equivalent game-changing policies, what are the other things that will make the difference in squeezing the gap? Now, parental employability and support and childcare support have been identified as potentially big ticket items in helping families. But what I said earlier was critical in that we can't just expect families who are up against it and have all these pressures to walk through a door that we open by, say, we develop a new scheme, a new support that we put out there that we think will help meet the mark and supporting parents into work, because we know obviously 80% of children living in poverty are within the 6 priority families. So there is the key. But we can't just say, right, here you have opened this scheme, come along, because that won't work because of all the pressures we know families are under. So we need to develop bespoke solutions that basically sit down with families and say, right, what are the barriers at the moment that we can help remove, whether that's through the tailored employability, tailored childcare that is more flexible, support for families who have additional caring responsibilities, perhaps someone with a disability with them, and also for the families from a Black and ethnic minority community, what are the barriers that are facing them that are meaning that they're not getting access to so many supports that are putting them way up there with that nearly 50% figure, which is really a cause for concern. So I think that is the solution. We need to not just create new doors, we need to actually walk with people to show them where the door is and help open that door and remove the barriers that are stopping them at the moment.
Thanks a lot, Brian. We've just got a few minutes left. It probably leaves us just one question from the audience. I'll just take it in the order that come to me. And this is from Satva. I'm assuming from One Parent Family Scotland. I'm looking at my colleague Jack, who's telling me that is the case. And she's asking Cabinet Secretaries, the question is, how can we get the same sense of urgency as we had within the COVID response and commitment across the Scottish Government with colleagues and councils to have the same focus and redirection of resources to end child poverty?
Yeah, well, that is actually the whole space that we're in at the moment, is that sense of urgency through the COVID recovery plan, that we need that sense of urgency, that can-do mentality where barriers are broken down, silos go, we work in partnership, not just with local authorities, but with third sector organisations and others to all face in the one direction. And it is absolutely about prioritisation. And that is a message that I think the Scottish Government has heard loud and clear. And, you know, I'm very challenging with my colleagues. You can be assured of that in terms of what more they can do within their areas of responsibility. So you're right, this is about national purpose, national mission. It has the absolute backing of the First Minister in terms of the changes that we need to make to be able to give focus to this. And I should say the Deputy First Minister as well, who's obviously leading the COVID recovery work. We're working with COSLA around also having a bit of a kind of focus in the same way as there was around the early years and the changes there, where there was a kind of recognition that we need big cultural change in the way that we tackle problems, and that cultural change has to be about not what we can't do, but what we can do. And COSLA and local government, I think, are on the same page as us. They want to support the families within their local council areas to help them move out of poverty, and we want to work with them in that mission.
Lovely, thanks very much. Well, thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for answering so many of our questions, coming, sitting in our hybrid room in here in Dundee. Just to wrap up, a few people have spoken about a perfect storm today, and this is partly a pattern that I've stolen actually from Neil at the Poverty Alliance, in that I don't like the comparison with a perfect storm, because a storm, there's nothing we can do about that. That's the weather. Whereas this, we know we can do things about poverty, and that's what this week is all about doing things. I talked about it as being like a dam where we're starting to see the cracks show. And the UK government are going to stick dynamite in the cracks with universal credit. But it's all about us providing and making a more resilient, stronger society. And it's great to hear so much from you about how we can deliver that in Scotland. So we really appreciate your time. I know you've got lots on this week in Challenge Poverty Week, as I'm sure people do across the internet, wherever you are. So look, thank you so much, Cabinet Secretary. Thank our End Poverty Scotland group for all your brilliant questions, and for everyone for coming along. So thanks very much, and hopefully see you all soon.
Thank you for all your questions. Thanks, Chris. Thank you.